Okay, thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to come and share a few thoughts, wild, crazy, lame, or otherwise. I actually have never been to HotMobile or its the precursor, WMCSA, but one of the very first, I think it was the first WMCSA, had a short article about an tour guide for a grocery store. Not really a tour guide, but a location where application in a grocery store. And that inspired one of the very first projects I did at Georgia Tech, an indoor tour guide system. So I've always kind of looked to this conference for ideas that inspire what one might do. What I'm going to talk about here, and don't take the title all that seriously. They asked me for a title and abstract, and I had the abstract. I didn't have the title, and I just, HotMobile, okay, hot or not. It's not really. I think that's about the end of that little pun you're going to see here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about things I've been thinking about for the last 5 or so years, where I've thought that the vision of Mark Weiser and ubiquitous computing has been fantastic, but it's really old. And it's time for us to think about moving on. And in moving on, I've actually found that I'm coming closer and closer to the actual vision of Mark Weiser, which maybe we'll have some time. So here's an outline of what I want to talk about. I was told I had 3.5 hours to speak, so I thought I would give a brief history of computing. So I'm going to do that first, cover the first 67 years of computing, and then talk a little bit about how that led to the vision of ubiquitous computing, and then what I think is a vision beyond Weiser, which basically is looking at technologies that Weiser didn't know about and didn't have into his vision. And so to boldly call this a 4th generation of interactive technology, but it actually is not a vision because it emerged last decade. I'm going to talk then about 2 research opportunities that are kind of inspired by what I think about as this 4th generation of computing. And if we have time, I have a 3-hour lecture on the vision of computing that is the 5th generation. So, but we won't get to that if I've taken the first 3 hours to do this first part. So, yes, I'm joking. So I'm going to give you 67 years of history in about 67 seconds, plus or minus 67 seconds. And the whole idea here is that you can trace interactive computing technologies from the very beginning, and there's a nice way to frame how various eras have progressed, or generations. So first, we have the mainframe generation. The vision was kind of inspired in the mid-30s by the Turing machine, Alan Turing's work. We had the notion that many people would interact with a single computing device, and there were a number of applications that first initially encouraged organizations to invest in the mainframe, and then once enough organizations had invested in them, a number of follow-on applications. So that's really the way we frame each of these generations, and that's the first generation. Second generation, Alan Kay and others gave the vision in the late 60s. This was the personal computing generation. The notion here was that one individual would have one device, and there were initial applications like the electronic spreadsheet that inspired organizations again to acquire these devices. And then once enough people had these devices, there were a number of other interesting follow-on applications. Then we go to Mark Weiser's vision, which was in the 90s, so about 30 years, actually the late 80s, about 20 years after the second generation. Here the main inspiration I think that Mark was providing was that one individual would interact with lots of devices. And these devices, there would not be a single canonical device, there would be a variety of devices that would range from being very small inch-scale devices to foot-scale devices to yard-scale devices. And a lot of what he was trying to come across came in the most eloquent first line to any scientific article I've ever read: the most profound technologies are those that disappear. Okay, so was anyone timing? That was about 2 minutes. We've gone through about 67 years of history here. About 4 or 5 years ago, I started to get fed up with these conferences that were defined around ubiquitous computing, because I said the problem with ubiquitous computing is that it's been so successful that it is just what computing research is, that all computing research was thinking in terms of what Weiser outlined as what was ubiquitous computing. And so I spun a little on the Weiser's first sentence and said the most profound research topics are those that disappear. The argument It was actually a hopeful message, but it was interpreted as a very negative message. But basically I was saying we can move on from having to have a niche conference to talk about ubiquitous computing because everyone is talking about ubiquitous computing. Hooray, that's great. So let's move on. The problem is that I didn't provide enough of an idea of what should be coming next. There's a couple paragraphs at the end of that paper, but I didn't. So I spent a lot of time since then thinking about, well, okay, what should the next vision be? And so we'll talk now about what the next vision of interactive technology should be. And the thing that surprised me was that it had already happened. So I'm going to describe the fourth generation of computing and describe the canonical technologies and some of the driving applications, and then talk about where the challenges lie within that. So if we take this framing of the generations of computing, we can see there are a number of cells that we need to fill out. Some of them are pretty easy. We had 30 years between generation 1 and generation 2 vision, 20 years from generation 2 to generation 3. We all know that technology is accelerating at a tremendous pace. So it would be foolish to think that we'd have to wait 30 years for a new set of technologies to arrive that might influence us. And in fact, when I thought about it, I said it actually turns out that the mid-2000s was when the vision and actually some of the realization of these new interactive technologies became clear. So that was a simple extrapolation. The next one was pretty simple too. You had many to one, one to one, one to many. Only one other option left. Many individuals interacting with many devices. Okay? So what we have to do now is think about what are the canonical technologies. So in thinking about technologies that that began to be very prevalent in the 2000s that were not part of Weiser's vision, there were 3 that I came up with. The first, cloud technologies. Now, even though the notion of distributed computing in academia, you can see references to it that go all the way back to around 1978. We had this notion of machines interacting with each other remotely, but we don't quite have the commodity notion of virtually unlimited storage and computation available to anyone on any device. And that started to become real in the mid-2000s with services from Amazon and other kinds of organizations. So this is one technology that was not something. In fact, the cloud is in some sense the extrapolation of the World Wide Web, and Weiser's vision didn't include the World Wide Web either. Next, the crowd. You might notice a little trend here. We have, when Turing introduced the notion of the computer, it was actually referred to as the automated computer, because in the 30s, what was a computer? A computer was literally a woman sitting in a room not unlike this room, entering data. Right? That was what a computer was. And Turing's notion was an automated computer. We tended to take away the automated and just refer to computer to replace the automated computer. But lo and behold, last decade, we started to reintroduce the human as a computing element, being able to crowdsource social computing that envelops that. I'm going to refer to all of these as just the crowd. So we have cloud technologies and we have crowd technologies. What's the next set of technologies? Well, this one is going to take me a little more time to develop because it's got to be memorable and clever. Just remember that. I'm trying to be memorable. I'm trying to be clever. So be gentle. You have the Internet of Things. Lots of devices that communicate with each other and provide the ability for machines to more effectively enter into all kinds of machines, enter into our digital ecosphere. Okay, this has become a big buzzword over the last 10 years, and a variety of commercial devices and lots of academic conferences popping up with the IoT buzzword. We also have another phenomenon, wearable computing, which has been around since the 60s. The idea of the cyborg goes at least that far back. We had in the 90s folks who actually tried to live the life of a cyborg, the wearable computing folks from MIT and other places. But starting last decade, we started to see commodity devices being sold in high numbers of devices that individuals would wear on their body. So wearable computing is not just mainstream, it's something that's here now. It's part of our everyday life. So we've got the cloud, the crowd, and internet plus wearables. Not very catchy. But the internet plus wearables effectively creates this layer over the physical world that connects, intimately connects the physical world with the digital world. So what is a covering? A shroud. So we have the cloud, the crowd, and the shroud. Those are the canonical technologies of the fourth generation. Okay? It's supposed to be memorable, and it rhymes. And I developed this idea and presented it for about 6 or 9 months, and then one of my colleagues came up to me and said, Gregory, did you realize that that rhymes with your last name? I said, no, I never did. So, but now the buzzword is it's cloud, crowd, and shroud, so says Aboud. Okay. But now that's only part of the framing of the fourth generation. We now need to think about what is it that drives the adoption of these technologies. So I'm now going to give you an example in our everyday lives that I would bet every single one of you experiences and has driven the merging of the cloud, the crowd, and the shroud. So many of you flew to maybe Jacksonville or other nearby airports and landed and had to find your way here. If you're anything like me, I love to travel with my family. I hate traveling alone. I don't do any kind of preparation, but I don't need to. In fact, yesterday morning, I just said to someone, I just need to know the rental car agency that I have and the hotel I'm supposed to go on. And in fact, I didn't even need someone to tell me that because I think it's on TripIt on my phone. But that's the point. I carry with me a device that allows me not only to get where I need to get wherever I land, whether or not I've been there before, and how is it delivering to me that navigational information? Those are delivered by cloud services to my device, so as long as my device is connected, I'm fine. But for those of you that are cheap like me and travel outside the United States or outside your data plan, you realize how lost you really can be this day and age when you don't have your personal navigation device with you. But it's even more interesting than that. That's the cloud delivering something to, a ubicomp, a third generation piece of technology. But we also have other forms of information like Weiser, which allows people to give you information that embellishes what can be found strictly from the databases that are out there on the cloud. That's individuals or the crowd providing you advice. The crowd also will help you figure out not just how to get somewhere, but where might you want to go, even if you've never been somewhere before, based on what your tastes and interests are. We can also have the crowd tell us not only where we want to go, how to get there, but maybe who else is there so we can decide whether we want to go there or not. So you have the crowd providing you lots of information to help you become a more and more expert navigator and personal entertainment individual. But it goes beyond that because this is the traditional ubicomp style of being able to deliver this information to you on your mobile phone. But we also have devices that we wear that can deliver this kind of information to us. We might even have these devices worn in different places. So the shroud is providing a variety of ways for us to get this information delivered to us and even deliver information back about what we've done. So there is an initial driving application for the merging of cloud, crowd, and shroud technologies. So the application theme, and don't worry so much about this particular name, but I called it collective computing. Here's what is important to remember. You're using the cloud to merge data from the shroud with intelligence from the crowd. And that rapidly empowers individuals with specialized expertise that go beyond the training of that individual. That's really, I think, what is the key to these kinds of driving applications. It's the union of all these technologies together. So the individual can harness on-demand expertise. We do this almost every day in the personal navigation and entertainment sphere. So this has already taken hold. Another way to think about this is you can be your own tour guide, health advisor, teacher. Well, we've seen examples of this first one, and I think we can be inspired to think about how you might harness expertise in other domains. So that's what I think the fourth generation is all about, being able to allow individuals to harness on-demand expertise in a variety of different domains. If you want to know a little bit more about this, I finally put this in writing, and it's published if you want to read and know exactly last month's issue of IEEE Computer. But I'm going to move on quickly from that to talk about some opportunities that this presents from a research perspective. And I'm going to talk about two different kinds of opportunities. One is an application that I think is ripe for exploitation by fourth generation mindset. And here, I'll just reflect that this is very similar to me as what Classroom 2000 was to me as a young assistant professor at Georgia Tech in the late 90s. I'm going to show you an application that, once it's realized, I think will be very compelling. It's not realized yet. But it's going to be made up of constituent technologies that all exist. So here's where you see Gregory as an applied computer scientist, without shame, saying, I don't have to invent lots of new technologies. You can invent new user experiences with those technologies. So for the students and the young untenured professors here, my third year as a professor at Georgia Tech, I got my third year review back, which is the first really critical review at Georgia Tech. And there was suggestion that my work was not very deep and not very impactful because this Classroom 2000 project, you were basically just integrating together pieces of existing technology. First of all, I knew right then and there that most of the colleagues who had that review were not really software engineers because they would know that the really hard thing in life is integrating existing technologies. But I wasn't able to communicate the point that I wasn't trying to invent new technologies. I was trying to invent new experiences. And I want to talk about some new experiences here that we might produce. Then the second opportunity I want to talk about is a little more mundane. I'm going to reflect again about another kind of cycle in our world of technology. And I'll describe that later. And it's going to come down to something that is some challenges, I think, that exist for the wearable computing experience. So the first bold application, or lame, you can substitute whichever you want. I'm going to call this Quantified Campus, trying to call to mind the notion of quantified self. And I, by no means, am the first person to think about that. I know at least one person, I think, who's here in the audience who's very relevant to this particular topic. But the idea here is, how can you get the digital footprint of a campus community, reflect on it, and use that information to predict the academic, physical, and mental wellness of the campus, of its students, and the people in that community. So that's the motivation, Quantified Campus. Why is this important? Well, for young adults, probably for the first time moving to independent life, having to do well academically, as well as having to take care of your physical and mental well-being. So a question that I'm interested in is, how can a campus community understand what causes stress for the individuals, the undergraduates in the campus, so that you can promote a healthy balance between your physical activity, your social activity, and your academic activity, without having painful losses. At least in the US, there are way too many cases of individual harm inflicted by individuals on themselves because they are not able to cope with the stress of independent college life. So, what's the inspiration for this Quantified Campus? I've given you the motivation for why to do it. Some of you may be familiar with the StudentLife project that Andrew Campbell and his colleagues did at Dartmouth. They started about three and a half years ago. It's been published in the last 2 ubicomps, and I believe both papers won Best Paper Awards at ubicomp. What they did back then was, in a class that Andrew was teaching that had about 50 to 70 undergrads and graduate students, they gave them an Android smartphone that had special software on it that essentially would track a lot of information on itself, what apps were being used, what location it was at, even the sound around the device, so that you might be able to infer whether individuals were engaged in social activities. Over the course of a 10-week quarter, they collected all that information, and then afterwards they reflected on that data, analyzed it to try to understand how might you determine, also during this study, they had individuals self-report notions of their perceived mental stress. and affect and mood. So they wanted to see were there things that people did that would correlate with how they reported how they felt. And there's some very interesting results that were published in the first paper, ubicomp 2014. The second paper tried to say, is there any way to track this data and see how it correlates to their academic performance? So I'm not giving this project its due recognition here. You should definitely read this. I think it'll come to be one of the seminal papers in this kind of work. But that inspiration leaves me thinking, if we consider this notion of how we can assess wellness of a campus and of its students with respect to the digital footprint, this is a wonderful opportunity for what I'm calling fourth generation technologies. And I think not only can we explore this in a more interesting way, we must explore it. So why is it relevant to the fourth generation? Well, I'll talk about this with respect to the canonical technologies. From the perspective of the shroud, we now today have a variety of devices that individuals can have on their body or near their body at all times. In addition to their smartphone, we have devices that you wear that track other physiological parameters. So the technology is there to be able to collect more and rich and continuous data. But we also have information in the shroud that is off the body, but in the environment. We more and more have the ability to understand an individual's interaction with the environment. So at most campuses, they have devices like, this is my Georgia Tech ID, called the Buzz Card at Georgia Tech. You use that to enter various locations, but also to purchase things around the campus, so we have that information. We have educational resources that are made available via the web. We can have knowledge of how individuals are interacting with that material. We have a variety of ways to handle the digital infrastructure of the environment to let us know how people, collections of people, maybe even more interestingly than an individual, are interacting with the environment itself. So the shroud is providing a huge amount of data continuously that we may be able to tap from. From the crowd perspective, lots of people engage in social media, particularly students, in a wide variety of different kinds of social media, those that are anonymous, those that are not anonymous. We also have the ability to start to provide mentoring service through crowdsourced peer mentoring capabilities. So individuals can seek help from other individuals by going to online forums or by asking questions to people who are like them but are not known by them. So the crowd can provide peer mentoring capabilities. And of course, we have places to store and compute all this information in the protected way that you need for this kind of potentially sensitive information. So we can start to do whole community and aggregate analysis as well as analysis on the individual. So our goal is to try to create a software infrastructure that allows not just Georgia Tech or Cornell or Dartmouth or Carnegie Mellon, as you'll see, to be able to explore this notion of the quantified campus, but many others to be able to explore it. And again, we're not the only ones trying to provide this kind of software infrastructure. But ultimately, the goal here in thinking about the application goal of collective computing is to empower a student to be their own academic counselor. There are lots of counseling services that are available at universities. One's to support academic questions, one to support mental wellness, but most individuals do not take advantage of them. They either don't know that they exist, they don't know that they need the help, or they're afraid to ask. So how can you deliver that kind of information directly to the individual without them having to necessarily go out and seek? Also, if everyone who needed mental health counseling at a university went to the mental health center on campus, they would not be able to be provided the service. They'd be overwhelmed. So there is a need to try to scale up those kind of services. So why not allow the individual to be empowered to get that information on demand? So this journey has already begun, working with Andrew and partners at Carnegie Mellon and Cornell and at Georgia Tech. We are moving forward on trying to do this quantified campus. We actually have other universities that we are gladly bringing into the fold. I see some here from Cambridge as well that we are connecting with to try to explore this as others are exploring. So again, we're not unique at doing this, but I think now is a wonderful time to think about really taking this kind of problem seriously. So that's the first kind of somewhat bold or lame application idea. Now I want to transition onto a different challenge. I said we've got lots of people having wearable devices, and there are more and more kinds of wearable devices that people can have. Ones that you can wear on your head, one that you can wear on your arms, ones that you can wear in a variety of places. So the question is, how many wearable devices is an individual going to have? What are you going to do about providing a seamless interaction experience across a variety of wearable devices? This is not a new problem. We've seen this before, and it's basically the tension between having single-purpose devices that do one thing really well and all-purpose devices that do lots of things, probably not as well, but you only need one of them as opposed to 10 of the single-purpose devices. We've seen this through a number of generations. So in the desktop world, the first personal computers really took hold because they were electronic spreadsheets, or they were electronic typewriters. But as soon as people had those devices, they said, well, I'm not going to have one device that's going to be my electronic spreadsheet and another device that's going to be my electronic word processor. I want one device that can do all these things. That's what the personal computer became. It did lots of things because it was a generic computing interaction platform. In the world of handheld devices, in the mid-90s, we had the Palm Pilot. Well, we had other ones that tried to be successful, like the Apple Newton, but the Palm Pilot beat out all those others because instead of trying to do everything, it did a small number of things really well. It did contact management, it did calendar management, and it did syncing between the device in your hands and the information you had on your desktop. Those few things, and it was small enough to carry with you. So it did those things really well. And then we had the mobile phone, or around the same time we had the mobile phone. Mobile phone was great for talking to other people. It became great for being able to communicate text to other people. And so we had two devices that we held. Then people said, well, we don't really need both those devices. We can do all those things on one device. And so we now have the smartphone that does everything in your pocket. It also burns a hole in your pocket because it's getting so hot, it's doing so many things all at once. Less compelling, we have the notion of the smart home, where initially you'd have individual remote controls for each of the devices that you'd like to control, and those became the universal, turned into a universal remote control that now didn't just control your entertainment collection, it would control all things in your house, so that now becomes a remote command center. So we see this going back and forth between the desire to have really good single-purpose devices and then the concern that you have too many of these single-purpose devices, and so they all get aggregated. But it's different with the wearable computing experience. We now have, in this age where we have a variety of these single-purpose devices, you know, the Fitbits. I would even argue that Google Glass is more single-purpose than it is all-purpose, being able to display something very easily. That's what it really does fairly well. But we fail when we try to create devices that do lots of things in one, because they end up only being used for a small number of things, and they're really bad at doing lots of things because it turns out to be an extremely difficult challenge to create a general-purpose computing device that does the things that we expect of it, like a personal computer or a smartphone, when you keep shrinking the interaction capability of that device. So I think in the world of wearable, if this is going to continue, the wearable experience, and I bet that it is going to, we're stuck with a collection of devices. And so what we need to do is remember, these are going to be islands of places where you can interact, and we need to start thinking about how do we have a unified wearable experience without having to have a single wearable device accomplish it. So there are a couple of examples, and these are mostly going to come from work in my lab. In fact, it's unpublished work in my lab, so turn off the cameras. No, doesn't matter. I don't care about sharing these ideas to people, because if you can do it better, you can do it better. Input that speaks to all devices. So one of the things that's really annoying about a variety of wearable devices is that they're very impoverished input devices. No one seems to spend much effort trying to create a wearable device that is just a good input device. Now we have some examples. What I have up here on the left is the Myo, which tries to take muscle activation with a forearm-mounted device and turn that into gestures that can be recognized. It's really only an input device, but we have very few examples of that. So Gabriel Reyes, one of my students, has been exploring this idea of how can you provide rich input with a wearable device that can then communicate that input to any other device. And really, it's going to seem a little grandiose to say this, the holy grail of wearable input is to be able to do text easily and quickly. Right? There's no wearable device that makes text easy to do other than using speech recognition, which is not always appropriate. So how might you provide a wearable device? So the idea here, and he's been exploring this for a couple of years in a wide variety of different technologies. This one is just demonstrating, well, it doesn't look so, it's not well designed from an industrial design perspective, but could certainly be a thumb ring that essentially can interpret the actions of the thumb with opposing fingers and with the rest of the hand. So you can do things like swipe in particular directions, you can tap on particular digits, you can double tap, you can tap on different phalanges of the finger to get a wider variety. You can actually do gestures across the hand with your thumb. So how rich an input vocabulary could you get with a reliable version of that? That's one. So a wearable input-only device. But there's another way we might try to explore this, and that's to take the existing devices that we have, unmodified, and allow them to do more in terms of input. So here's a quick example of something, a project called Watch Out by 3 students listed here, that's trying to show how you might exploit.
Interactions on a smartwatch are largely based on the touchscreen. However, the relatively small size of a watch screen limits the accuracy and richness of interactions. We present Watch Out, a system that extends interactions outside the touchscreen of a watch using only embedded inertial sensors and supporting 3 different gesture families: bezel buttons, side tap, and band swipe. The first gesture family is bezel buttons. Bezel buttons allows the user to tap on up to 8 distinct locations on the watch bezel and extends the interaction beyond the touchscreen area. The second gesture set is side tap. The user can tap the left or right side of the watch case for eyes-free and always available gestures. The third gesture set is band swipe. Band swipe turns the band of a watch into an interactive surface by recognizing 4 different directional swipes.
That's all I'll show you for that one. There are a number of applications of this, but the idea is that without modifying the smartwatch and just using the sensing on the smartwatch, you can introduce a wider variety of input events by tapping around either a square or a round bezel or interacting with the band of the watch and being able to detect and identify those events surprisingly well. Cheng Zhang, who did the Watch Out work as well, is currently exploring using the inertial sensing and the microphone on a device to allow you to interact on the skin around a particular device. In an earlier version of this, he didn't expect you to put those landmarks on your hand, but just to make it clear to the audience. You could tap on one side or tap on another side, but you could actually tap a number of places along on the back of your hand and also swipe to do gestures. And what he's currently implementing is the ability to do text input by doing graffiti-like gestures that can be recognized by the phone without modifying the phone whatsoever. So now you can take advantage of this sensing platform and provide the wider kind of input. So that's input focused, but it's not creating an input device. It's taking advantage of the sensing that's on the device that you already have. The last thing I want to talk about here is the fact that what's interesting about a variety of these handheld and wearable devices is that they have significant sensing on them, and you can essentially interpret motion gestures by an individual. Taking a phone out of your pocket and waving in particular directions, tapping or moving your head in a particular way, taking devices and matching them to each other. So there are lots of things we can think about, but what we want to do is put the power of imagination into designers who would think about how would these kinds of motion gestures work in everyday life for people who would have a variety of these technologies. And so the challenge there is how do you provide a way for designers to essentially create, explore, and rapidly prototype what is essentially a machine learning activity recognition challenge when they don't have the training to do that. So my student Aman Parnami and Apurva Gupta have been working on a tool to make it easy for individuals to create motion-based gestures. And the real contribution of this work, in addition to being able to collect and find training examples, is to do this in the context of the actual gesture itself. So by implementing all this capability on a smartphone, what's interesting is you can now take the smartphone wherever you want. And I can design gestures for that phone on the phone. I could design it for wearable devices on my hand using the phone as an interface. They actually have a version of Google Glass that lets you do the entire gesture design all just on Google Glass. What's important there is not just the simplification of the training and creating the gestures, but that you can do the gestures in the context where you expect them to be performed, instead of being tethered to a development machine in your lab. I'm going to skip this. So I have just about 10 o'clock. We're supposed to break at 10:30, and I'm sure you all have lots of disagreement with what I've said up to this point that you're just dying to share with everyone and with me. So I'm going to fairly quickly go through something that will provide even more disagreement so that we can have interesting discussion. And I'm going to talk about what I think is actually a vision of technologies of the future, and what I'll call the 5th generation of computing technology. And I'm going to motivate this very simply. I talked about Mark Weiser's 1991 paper, first sentence of which you should all have memorized. The most profound technologies are those that disappear. But how many in this audience know the second sentence? Into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. Interesting. So, Weiser meant that figuratively. But actually, we are at the dawn of an era where we can take that second line literally. So today, we have the ability to print a variety of electronic capabilities onto paper or two-dimensional substrates very easily with very sophisticated but relatively simple to use inkjet and printing technologies. We also have the ability to produce very small electronic fibers that can be woven into existing materials. So we're in an era now where we can pretty much attach a variety of computing elements to just about any kind of physical object. That's nice, and that's starting to weave them into the fabric of everyday life. But I think what we're soon going to be able to do is actually manufacture two-dimensional, one-dimensional materials. And in the manufacturing process, they will end up having computing capabilities. I'm going to refer to this as computational skin. This, I think, is the technology of the 5th generation. There will be, and there have been, advances in materials engineering and manufacturing. It's very important to think about this from a manufacturing perspective, not just the materials engineering perspective. These are going to result in the surface of any object being able to perform basic computational things. By that I mean it can store information, it can compute logical operations, it can communicate within a surface and between surfaces, it can sense phenomenon outside of its surface or on top of its surface, it can be actuated to do things, and most importantly, and what you are probably most skeptical about, or should be, is that they'll be able to harvest their own power to do all of the above. Most of the examples we see today of printed electronics show you in really cool videos of things is how we connect that printed electronic magic from the power that makes it work. Computational skin will essentially allow us to create things like a Post-it note, a piece of paper that will be able to know things about what's on it and be interacted with like a piece of paper. And more interestingly, it can do things like place it on a wall, and the wall will know that that piece of paper is there. You could rip it in two and understand that it's now two different computational items. That's what we're thinking, that's what I think, is where the future of computing technology can go. We might be able to produce, or we will be able to produce, cartons, food containers that understand things about the amount of contents, the freshness of its contents. And yes, we have examples of being able to do this today, but it's largely done by attaching a computational capability to the container, as opposed to the container itself being enabled to perform this and being able to harvest the power to be able to do the sensing and to do the communication. Now, I have a lot of colleagues who are interested in this that scoff because they say, oh, you're never going to be able to provide the wireless communication you need in order to provide this vision of computational skin. To which I say, you are right the way you are probably thinking about wireless communication, because most people, probably a lot of people in this audience, think about wireless communication as you need to get lots of data fast, quickly over a long distance. But in the world of computational skin, let's think about the fact that just about every object comes in contact with some other object. We don't have to be thinking about long-range, high-bandwidth wireless communication in order to realize some of the vision of a world of computational surfaces. I have more here, but I'm going to skip forward because I want you to have the opportunity to disagree. So, you might ask, who could possibly do this? And the answer is certainly not me. But this is where I think an interesting lesson for those who are thinking about starting a career in computing. When I started or restarted my career in computing and was inspired by Mark Weiser, I very quickly realized that the way I was taught computer science was no longer enough of the information I needed to have in order to be a relevant, ubiquitous computer scientist. I needed to understand more about electronics and sensing in order to be interesting in the world of ubiquitous computing. The merging or remerging of hardware and software skills are important. In this fifth generation, I'm thinking about, well, hardware and software still remain important, but the materials that are used to produce computing elements are going to be extremely important. A lot of what I'm talking about here that's new is fabricating materials without silicon-based fabrication techniques. So understanding the properties of a variety of different kinds of materials and nanomaterials is going to become paramount to being able to invent and dream in this particular space. So you see the merging of people in chemical and biomolecular engineering, material science and engineering, as well as the traditional electrical and computer engineering, the RF and power harvesting folks, and all that makes up computing. So here's a team of people that we've assembled at Georgia Tech and working with other folks that are trying to look at this vision of computational skin. So I'm going to stop there and just give you a wrap-up of the things that if you fell asleep, you can wake up now and I'll summarize the entire talk. It was boring. It was lame. But I was trying to think beyond Weiser's ubicomp. And there's a lot we can do to try to define the future of computing. The first generation after Weiser, which I called the fourth generation, had a variety of new technologies that we can think about that were not in Weiser's vision, specifically what I called the cloud, the crowd, and the shroud of technology. And the notion that it can help you deliver on-demand expertise when used together. I gave you one application idea of the Quantified Campus, and I gave you a challenge, I think, that exists for wearables that did not exist in the past, and that we will not get away from a collection, an aggregation of wearable devices. So we need to start thinking about how to make a unified wearable experience with a necessarily disaggregated set of devices. And then I said, that's all great. That's the fourth generation. We should all be pushing on applications driving that now. But around the corner very soon is going to be this merging of material science and computing that will change what we think of as a computer. And I described it to you as computational skin. And it's going to let us rethink this notion of the computer and its relationship with us. But even as much as I said this is beyond Weiser, Mark already thought about it. Technology is going to weave its way into the fabric of our everyday lives to the point where it will be indistinguishable. And I'll leave you with that. Just a parting thought about what should motivate you to work on problems is not getting credit for yourself, but in solving those problems. Thank you very much.